Welcome back to Racing Rundown. This is Jack Sargent here, and I am coming to you with my preview, my first of the three previews that I'm going to be doing for the 2023 Breeders' Cup on my own here on Racing Rundown. And this is the Breeders' Cup Turf, the race that I am personally the most excited for this weekend, just because I think that this is a very fascinating rendition of the Breeders' Cup Turf. We'll get into all 13 horses for this race like we do with all of them, but I will mention, be sure to check out the links below in the description of this video. You will have a link to the playlist that will have all 14 of the videos, or of the previews that we're going to do on Racing Rundown. So that playlist will be below in the description, so you can check out the other Breeders' Cup races that we do in addition to this one. As I said, we're going to get into this race now, the Breeders' Cup Turf, and we're going to start off with the number one horse. That's Bye Melvin, one of two horses in here for Graham Motion. Graham Motion won this race most recently in 2014 with Main Sequence, and Bye Melvin is one of his two chances in this race, as I mentioned, with his stablemate Highland Chief. And Bye Melvin is very interesting in this race for Graham Motion, and it's based on the last couple of runs that he has had. Most recently, a runner-up effort last time in the Turf Classic at Aqueduct behind Warlike Goddess, who is the morning line third choice in this race at 9-2. Bye Melvin, second in that race prior to his Grade 1 placing effort at Aqueduct. He won going a mile and an eighth at Saratoga in Allowance Company, and prior to that was fourth in another allowance race at Saratoga back in 2020. So 3 runs this year. Coming out of last year, he came out of a very disappointing effort in the Manhattan. But the reason that Bye Melvin is intriguing in this race is because of how this race is going to set up from a pace perspective. There's no one really in this race that is super itching to go to the frontier. You have Channelmaker, but Channelmaker, isn't the fastest horse in the world. Stone Age has been forwardly placed in some of his past races, but there's not going to be a whole lot of speed early on in this race, and this is, not the most talented group of horses in the world. So Bye Melvin has every chance to last in this race. Now, I'm not saying that he's going to win the Breeders' Cup Turf or anything, but I do think that he can go out there, set a strong pace, get a strong run early on, and maybe hang around and pick up something toward the end of this race. And at 15-1 right now in the morning line, something that could end up floating up a little bit toward the end of the day on Saturday, well worth a look at for Bye Melvin in this race. We're going to move on now to the number 2 horse, Warlike Goddess, who, as far as I'm concerned, is the best horse in this race. Warlike Goddess, it's very difficult to talk about her and not take the jackhammer to Joel Rosario, no pun intended there. And I do hate to be this person, but this race is entirely going to depend on whether or not Warlike Goddess gets the ride that she needs to get from Joel Rosario in this race. And really, that's Joel Rosario barely doing anything. Warlike Goddess is the kind of horse that wins when you don't get in her way. Last year, she lost this race. Now, I was less critical of Julien Leparoux in last year's Filly and Mare Turf than a lot of other people were. But Julien Leparoux did move a touch too soon, trying to get first run on Love's Only You in that Filly and Mare Turf. And that's one of the contributing factors as to why Warlike Goddess got beat in that spot. Warlike Goddess also had a very ugly loss in the very one at Gulfstream going back to February of 2021. Also, some things where she wasn't allowed to do her own thing. But the biggest example of this was obviously in this year's Flower Bowl. Joel Rosario restrained her, and she wanted to get going a lot earlier than Joel Rosario let her get going. She got held in late. She didn't need to get held in off the turn, but she did get held in based on when she got moving. And ultimately, she did come running toward the end of the race, but it wasn't enough to catch Virginia Joy there. But the big positives for Warlike Goddess in this race: she's getting her best distance. Her best distance is 1.5 miles. She's coming out of a very good victory in the Turf Classic at Aqueduct. And that was against the boys, obviously her first career start doing that. But prior to that, she also won the Glens Falls and the Bewitch, both at 1.5 miles this year. Last year, she won also the Glens Falls and the Bewitch at 1.5 miles. So 4 for 4 in races where she's going 1.5 miles. And, as much grief as we've given Joel Rosario, and rightfully so, I do think that she would have won that Flower Bowl if it was 1.5 miles. I again, I'm afraid that Warlike Goddess is going to be ridden how she has been ridden prior to the Turf Classic. The Turf Classic is the textbook definition of how to ride Warlike Goddess. Don't get in her way, just let her do her thing, and she gets the job done. To me, she's the best horse in this race, and I would have felt bad. I would have felt wrong going against her just based off of one factor, and that would be Joel Rosario. And I think I'm going to place the faith that Joel Rosario is going to do the right thing in this race, and we're going to get a winning effort for Warlike Goddess, and hopefully finally she can win an Eclipse Award that she deserves to win, that she was deprived of last year, but we're not going to get into the politics surrounding that. But Warlike Goddess, assuming that everything goes right, is the best horse in this race, and she should take this race out. Not going to say no problem, but she should take this race out. I'm going to move on now to the number 3 horse in this race, the first of a pair entered in here for Aidan O'Brien. That is third place finisher in the Belmont Derby, Stone Age, and one-time third choice in the Epsom Derby. But Stone Age has really fallen off form since Epsom, and his form going into Epsom wasn't the greatest, but especially exiting Epsom, it's not been great. Third in the Belmont Derby. I will say about that Belmont Derby run, Classic Causeway tripped out there. I think he could have potentially won the Belmont Derby, but I think more likely run second behind Nation's Pride in that race if Classic Causeway didn't trip out to the manner that he did. Next time in the Saratoga Derby, didn't really run well at all. There's not really anything that I could point to as to why he didn't really run too well there. And then in the Irish Champion Stakes, I kind of feel like that he was the pacemaker in there for his stablemate Luxembourg, but there's really not a whole lot to draw from that Irish Champion Stakes. And then last time out, the Champion Stakes at Ascot, he made the running early on in the race, backed out toward the end. You could say he's getting firm ground in this race, and certainly the firm ground didn't hurt him at Belmont Park. But at the same time, Stone Age is very much like Bolshoi Ballet in terms of both of those two horses were very hyped going into the Derby. Bolshoi Ballet was favored, Stone Age was not favored, but both very hyped. They both ran a good race at Belmont Park, and then when the competition got tougher, their true talent came to show, and I don't think Stone Age has a really strong chance in this race. So he's a rather easy pass for me in here. Again, I think that he's an interesting pace horse, adds something to the early dynamic of this race, but Stone Age, his best runs this year seem to be behind him. One spot outside of him is his stablemate for Aidan O'Brien, Broome, who is a horse that I view a lot more highly than I do his stablemate Stone Age. And that's because Broome is, Broome last year at a pretty decent price ran a very good second in the Breeders' Cup Turf last year behind Yabir. He picks up, Irad Ortiz gets back up for this race, and Irad was certainly very much a factor into why he ran as well as he did in the Breeders' Cup Turf. And the price is probably going to be very similar, I would say a bit higher than it was last year, 12-1 right now on the morning line, but probably going to be very similar to that 8-1, around the 8-10-1 range that Broome was last year in the Breeders' Cup Turf, and he's well worth a bet at that kind of a price in this race. Now, there are a couple of things that give me reservations about Broome. Number one is he's only got one win this year. That was at Ascot in the Hardwick, and I will say, good thing about that race is it was on firm ground, and this is a horse that really seems to do better over the firm stuff than on the softer stuff. So certainly a point in his corner, but that group that he beat in the Hardwick was not a very strong group. Mostadaf, who was in there, ran terrible in the Arc. Hurricane Lane, the last year's Ledger winner, was in that race. Good on paper, but Hurricane Lane did not come back nearly the same horse that he was this year. So ultimately, took out that Hardwick against a very weak group. Followed that up with a run at Ascot. Didn't run terrible in the King George, but he was beaten by Mishriff there, and I'll get into Mishriff a little bit later. But left a lot to be desired there. Came to America, ran at Saratoga, was very wide throughout in that race, and ultimately, I think that was a contributing factor as to why he lost, but at the same time, I would have hoped that Broome could have run a lot better. Guffaw and Miramichon did not come back to run well in their subsequent races, so I think that that's something to think about when you look at Broome. And then disappointing run in the Irish Champion Stakes. He was wheeling back pretty quickly in there, and like I said, doesn't really get the soft stuff too well. It was soft going in that Irish Champion Stakes, and then it was a bog at Longchamp in the Arc, and I thought that his run in the Arc was actually okay, considering that the ground was never going to be favorable for him. So Broome, I think, is an interesting horse in here at a price, but ultimately I decided to go elsewhere because I don't trust the runs that he's had in the U.S. this year, but certainly worth a look at. Picks up IRAD, going to be going to be decent value in this race, all things considered. We're going to move on now to the first of two horses in this race for Charlie Appleby, and that is Rebels Romance, James Doyle's mount in this race. And Rebels Romance, probably remember him from the Kentucky Derby Trail last year. Won the UAE Derby on the dirt, was a contender for the Belmont Stakes before having to pull out the week of the race. Since then, this year, switched to the turf for the first time in his career, and it resulted in 4 wins for him, including back-to-back Group 1 successes in Germany, and 2 stakes successes at Newmarket and Goodwood, respectively, in his 2 runs before going to Germany. And both of them, or all 4 of those races, I should say, were at 1.5 miles. So the good thing with Rebels Romance is you know that the distance is very much in his corner. He is a 3-1 morning line favorite for this race, which I did find kind of odd because William Buick opted to get on his stablemate, and we saw how key William Buick's Choice paid in last year's Breeders' Cup, and other factors added to that. I thought that it was a very peculiar choice, but Rebels Romance is not without a chance in this race. The reason I'm not going to go with Rebels Romance in here is because I haven't been overly impressed with any of his wins that he's had this year. They've been good races, but, suspect competition level that he was beating in Germany, and then the first stakes win that he had at Newmarket was basically a Godolphin invitational there. So ultimately, Rebels Romance is rather weak on class. Again, the big benefit that I would say for him, the big positive, is I know that he's going to stay in this race. So that's certainly something to think about. But ultimately, I'm looking elsewhere because I don't like the price right now that Rebels Romance is. And I don't think he's going to go off favored. But even then, not super crazy about him at the price that he's going to be. So going to pass on Rebels Romance in here. But I can understand why someone might go to him in this race. I'm going to move on now to the number 6 horse in here. That's Channelmaker. The grizzled veteran in this race comes back for another Breeders' Cup turf. And the interesting thing about Channelmaker is the last 2 years, he finished the best of the U.S. contingent in the 2020 Breeders' Cup turf and the 2021 Breeders' Cup turf. He was 5th last year, beaten in front by 4 Europeans. 2020, he was 3rd, beaten by Magical and the winner Tarnawa. So 2 good runs for Channelmaker in Breeders' Cup subsequently, and he's another one that the pace of this race is going to certainly benefit him. Obviously does like to do his running from the front earlier on in these races, and he ran well in the Sycamore last time at Keeneland. Now, at this stage in his career, he's not going to win the Breeders' Cup turf, and really probably at any stage of his career, he wasn't going to win a race where, you're getting good European competition and maybe your top U.S.-based horse. Probably was never going to beat those horses, but at the same time, Channelmaker in this race is 30-1 right now in the morning line. He was a massive long shot last year, I think around 40 or something at Del Mar, and he ran 5th. Now, you don't get paid for that, but certainly something to think about with Channelmaker is you're going to get a good amount of value with him in this race. And if he's up there setting a slow pace earlier on in there, could potentially hang around. And he's finished ahead of some, he's finished ahead of Americans in Breeders' Cup turfs in past years. And even if his stablemate Warlike Goddess is better than him, I would take Channelmaker over just about every other American in this race, based on his past running lines. And he's also got 2 good runs at Keeneland this year. He won the he won the Elkhorn at 1.5 miles, and his run last time in the Sycamore is a lot better than it may look based on just the 4 there. So Channelmaker, I think, well worth a consideration in this race. Ultimately, I'll get into my value plays underneath in this race, but I think Channelmaker, well worth some consideration underneath in this race. I'm going to move on now to the number 7 horse, the Jockey Club Derby winner, Nation's Pride. And Nation's Pride also the Saratoga Derby winner, but most recently won the Jockey Club Derby at 1.5 miles last time out at Aqueduct. And Nation's Pride has been very good since coming to the United States. He's a classic Causeway, tripping out in an Emmanuel scratch in the Belmont Derby, away from having swept that series. So plenty to like about Nation's Pride coming out of that. The big question that you have for Nation's Pride in this race is he's never faced Olders before. And he didn't beat anybody last time in the Jockey Club Derby. Now, I'm not using that as a knock for him. I'm more knocking him that he hasn't beat Elders. And I also just think Warlike Goddess is a touch better than him. But it certainly is something to think about with Nation's Pride that he hasn't done it against older horses in his career. And last time showed that the 1.5 miles, I think, is well within his wheelhouse. It was an absolute procession there. He was another one that was also ran in the Derby. But I as I've said, I think a lot highlier of him. I think he's progressed much more than Stone Age has since Epsom, and well worth inclusion in this race. Ultimately decided to not pick him on top, but well worth inclusion in any exotics or underneath wagers or even multi-race wagers if you're playing this race that way. We're going to move on now to the number 8 horse in this race, the one horse that I really am outright dismissing, and that's Masterpiece. Long shot in this race for Michael McCarthy. Comes in from California. Masterpiece won the Eddie Reed Stakes back in July at Del Mar. It is a decent upset winner of that race. Here's another horse that I have said in the past does like the distance, 1 3/8. His last 2 runs doing that. He ran second in the Del Mar handicap in consecutive years, but at the same time, he's going up against better competition than he's ever gone up against in his career. And I think that his, of the 2 Californians in this race, if I were to use any of them, Gold Phoenix is the one that I would prefer of the 2. So I'm going to pass on Masterpiece in this race. But that's a perfect segue to get into his stablemate. And I'm sorry, not stablemate, his fellow state entrant, Gold Phoenix, who was the winner of that Del Mar handicap. Last time got beat in the John Henry going 1.25 miles at Santa Anita. But I said after that John Henry, he's a horse that, potentially you could think about as an underneath play in a Breeders' Cup because he is going 1.5 miles in here. And he has proven to like the more ground the better for him. And he's never missed the board. And I should further specify, he's never finished out of the money in 9 career starts, 3 wins, 3 seconds, and 3 thirds. So, he's going to be a shot in this race, and he's not a win contender, but, I would imagine that he'll stay around that 20-1, if not be significantly higher than that. And, a show wager in this race, definitely not out of the question for Gold Phoenix. Again, not a win contender, but a horse that I would consider to use underneath because he was closing well at the end of the John Henry. Obviously, he won at 1 3/8 in Del Mar handicap. I think you give him 1.5 miles, he could potentially hit the board in this race at a price. I'm going to move on now to the other horse that, and I should correct myself, the other horse that I outright dismissed, and that's Red Knight for Mike Maker, coming out of a win in the Kentucky Turf Cup, and he ran a good race there, but Mike Maker tag-teamed the race for him. Mike Maker had several horses in there that were kind of entered as rabbits, or ended up acting as though entering as rabbits for him in that Kentucky Turf Cup. Didn't run well last time in the Sycamore. He's never run against Grade 1 competition before. This is certainly going to be the toughest group that he's ever had to go up against in his career. Mike Maker can pull upsets, but this would be a massive shock if Mike Maker were able to pull this one out. So, gonna take a pass on Red Knight here in this race for that reason. Gonna move on now to number 11 in this race, Mishriff. I think the most interesting of the European horses, and I'm gonna try to say things as concise as I can with Mishriff, but I'm also gonna give Mishriff his fair due. Mishriff was a horse that I considered picking on top in here, and the reason is I wanted to go to horses that were coming out of defeats in the arc, because obviously with the ground playing the way that it was never going to work out in there. And Mishriff is also a horse that generally tends to do better running when he gets firm going. He has won over soft going before, but as of late in his career, definitely does tend to like firmer going better. And he's certainly going to get that at Del Mar. And he's also not a horse that I've ever sold out on him being able to get 1.5 miles in. It's not his preferred distance. Mishriff is 1.25 mile horse in most cases. But Mishriff does have 3 runs at 1.5 miles that I want to talk about. He won the Dubai Shima Classic last year over filly and mare turf winner from 2021, Loves Only You, and Chronogenesis in there. It was a good run for him there. Followed that up with, after running in the Eclipse at Sundown, went to the King George at Ascot. And that was going 1.5 miles. Ran a very strong second there behind Adiyar, the Derby winner from 2021. And then this year in the King George, ran third there, well beaten 11 lengths by the winner Pile Driver and Torquator Tasso. But he did miss the break, lost about 5 lengths at the start. So certainly, you could forgive him for that. And a reason why I thought to give him some consideration here, because there was some stuff that you can look at with Mishriff and take out of that King George. That being said, the reason I didn't go to Mishriff in this race was because he hasn't been in great form as of late. And I went back and when watching the King George in 2021, he got beat by a better horse going Adiyar's preferred distance. And he's going to be going up against Warlike Goddess and probably Nation's Pride's preferred distance. 1.5 miles isn't his preferred distance, it's those horses' preferred distance. And when he goes 1.5 miles, he can get it, but he's not as sharp as he is. And if we're playing devil's advocate here with Mishriff and just saying, let's just say that he is at his 2021 form, I still don't think that it's good enough to beat a Warlike Goddess or a Nation's Pride in this race. So ultimately, a horse that was interesting in here, but I had to look against because I just don't think 1.5 miles is his game in this Breeders' Cup turf. Nautilus is the number 12 horse for Paulo Lobo in this race, and this will be Nautilus's first start in the United States. He's a kind of mystery horse coming up from South America. I couldn't really find too much of a case for him, and, because there's not really a whole lot to go off of, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on him, but he's going to be the right price in this race, and Paulo Lobo has been able to have some success with taking horses up from South America and having them have some good runs in Grade 1 races in this country. So not without a chance is Nautilus in here to at least run a solid race underneath here, but there are better options in this race, and ultimately I'm going to go with one of those better options underneath in this race. Final horse that we have to get to is Highland Chief, the other of the 2 Graham Motion horses in this race, and Highland Chief is coming out of a win in the Sycamore Stakes at Keeneland. As I mentioned, he beat Channelmaker in that start, and Highland Chief was a horse that I thought might potentially, after being the upset winner of the Man of War, might potentially take a couple steps forward and run some good races this year. Ultimately, didn't live up to those expectations. Didn't run bad in the Manhattan, but also didn't win there. In the Manhattan form hasn't been the greatest, and then he was beaten in the Bowling Green. I thought that was a really poor effort there, but ran a good race last time in the Sycamore. And I think, again, he's another horse that's a price. Graham Motion in long turf races can pull some upsets. I'm not saying that he's going to win, but maybe he's one that you consider along with his stablemate in this race because they are the right prices to go underneath in this spot. We're going to get into my picks now for this race. As I said, Warlike Goddess is going to be my top selection in this race. I just think that 1.5 miles is her game. This is her Breeders' Cup turf to win. If ever she was going to run in a Breeders' Cup turf, this is the one for her to run in. So Warlike Goddess is going to be my top choice in here. I'm going to go to Channelmaker and Gold Phoenix underneath for my 2 long shot horses here. Now, I'm not using this as a trifecta or anything. I'm just saying that if you're looking for horses underneath in this race, those are the 2 to go with. Gold Phoenix and Channelmaker. If I was going to play a try in this race, I would probably play it Warlike Goddess, not Rebels Romance, Nation's Pride, and then Channelmaker. But I would say that either Channelmaker or Gold Phoenix are perfectly live horses to run good races underneath. And with that being said, that's going to be it for my Breeders' Cup Turf preview. As I said at the top of this video, be sure to check out my other stuff here on Racing Rundown and the other previews that we will have over the course of this week. We'll see you for those. Have a good one.